There is a specific kind of tiredness that lives only in the legs, not the tiredness that comes from running or hiking or spending 8 hours on your feet at work. That kind makes sense. That kind you earned, and your body knows how to recover from it. You sleep, you wake up, it is gone. This is different. This is the heaviness that descends around 7 or 8 in the evening, sometimes earlier, sometimes without any particular reason tied to what you did that day. You could have sat at a desk for 9 hours and your legs still feel like they are made of something denser than they were that morning. They ache in a way that is not quite pain. It is more like pressure, like gravity has increased specifically for your lower limbs. You elevate them on a pillow or the arm of the sofa and it helps a little. You lie down and they restlessly want to move, or they throb quietly in the dark while the rest of you tries to sleep. Most people who experience this have been told some version of the same thing. You are tired. You are getting older. Maybe lose a little weight. Try compression stockings. The conversation, when it happens at all, tends to last about 4 minutes and end with a prescription or a shrug, and the person walks out of the appointment carrying the same legs and the same unresolved question. Why? The answer to that question is not simple, but it is specific. And it is considerably more important than most people who experience it every evening have been led to believe, because the legs are not misbehaving. They are producing every night with remarkable consistency the external symptom of internal processes that have names, mechanisms, and this is the part that gets lost in the 4-minute appointment, interventions that actually work. What the heaviness is telling you depends on which of several converging systems is failing, and often it is more than one. But there is a common thread that runs through virtually every case of chronic evening leg heaviness, and it is one that medicine has historically treated as a plumbing problem when it is, at its deepest level, a metabolic and inflammatory one. That thread is venous insufficiency, but not the way it is usually explained. The standard explanation goes like this. The veins in your legs have one-way valves that prevent blood from pooling as gravity pulls it downward. When those valves weaken, blood pools in the lower legs. The veins distend. The surrounding tissue accumulates fluid. The legs feel heavy, swollen, tired. This is chronic venous insufficiency. Treat with compression, elevation, and in some cases, procedures to close the affected veins. This explanation is true as far as it goes. The problem is where it stops. It stops at the valve. It treats the valve as the beginning of the story when the valve is actually near the end of it. Because the valves do not weaken randomly and they do not weaken uniformly across the population, and the epidemic of venous insufficiency that now affects an estimated 40% of women and 25% of men over 50 in Western countries is not primarily a mechanical story. It is a vascular wall story. It is an inflammation story. It is, in many cases, a story about what has been happening to the tissue that makes up those venous walls for decades before the valves showed any sign of failing. The wall of a vein, like the wall of an artery, is a living structure. It is made of smooth muscle cells and connective tissue, threaded with collagen and elastin, lined on the inside with the same kind of endothelial cells that line arterial walls. And those endothelial cells in the venous system, just as in the arterial system, are extraordinarily sensitive to inflammation, to oxidative stress, to chronic glucose exposure, and to the hormonal and metabolic environment surrounding them. When the venous endothelium becomes inflamed, it loses its functional capacity. The smooth muscle in the venous wall loses its ability to maintain appropriate tone. The connective tissue becomes less elastic. The valves, which depend on a structurally healthy vein wall to close properly, begin to fail. Not because of some mechanical inevitability of aging, but because the tissue they are embedded in has been progressively compromised by a decade or more of systemic inflammation that nobody was measuring specifically in the venous system because nobody was looking. This is the version of the story that changes what you do about it. I want to tell you about a man named Thomas. He was 61, a secondary school geography teacher who spent his career standing at the front of classrooms, walking corridors, managing the particular physical demands of a profession that sounds sedentary to people outside it, but is genuinely not. He was lean, moderately active, did not drink excessively, was not diabetic. On paper, not the profile of someone with significant vascular compromise. He had been experiencing the evening leg heaviness for 3 years. Both legs, left worse than right. By 7 p.m., climbing the stairs to his bedroom felt like waiting. He had been told it was varicose veins. He had visible ones on the left calf and had been offered a referral to a vascular surgeon for sclerotherapy, the procedure that injects a solution into the affected veins to close them. He had not taken the referral because something in the conversation had not satisfied him. He had asked what was causing the varicose veins, and the answer he had received was that valves weaken with age and prolonged standing. He had asked what he could do about it, and the answer had been compression stockings and the surgery referral. He was not opposed to the procedure. He was opposed to having the procedure without understanding what had produced the problem in the first place. He wanted to know if the same process would simply create new varicose veins after the existing ones were closed, which is in fact a common experience. Sclerotherapy and other vein closure procedures can provide significant relief and are sometimes necessary, but in the absence of addressing the underlying vascular environment, the insufficiency often progresses in adjacent vessels over subsequent years. Thomas's venous problem was the visible part of something broader. His inflammatory markers told a story that his vein consultation had not requested. His high-sensitivity CRP was 3.8. His fasting insulin was 12, technically within normal range, but at the metabolically significant level where insulin resistance begins to compromise vascular function. His homocysteine was 16 micromoles per liter, elevated above the 10 to 12 considered safe for vascular health, driven by insufficient folate and B12 intake in a diet that had quietly narrowed in variety as he aged. None of these numbers would have appeared in a vein clinic consultation focused on managing the structural manifestation of the problem. All of them were contributing to the structural manifestation through mechanisms that are now well characterized. Elevated insulin drives venous wall smooth muscle proliferation through IGF-1 signaling, the same growth-promoting pathway relevant to cancer cell behavior, now showing up in the context of vascular wall remodeling. When venous, smooth muscle cells are chronically exposed to elevated insulin, they hypertrophy. The vein wall thickens unevenly. Compliance, the vein's ability to expand and contract in response to changes in blood volume and pressure, decreases. The valve mechanisms embedded in this thickened, stiffer wall begin to fail. Elevated homocysteine is directly toxic to endothelial cells. This is one of the most established findings in vascular biology and one of the most consistently underapplied in clinical practice. Homocysteine at elevated levels generates oxidative stress at the endothelial surface, reduces nitric oxide bioavailability, promotes inflammation in the vascular wall, and directly impairs the structural integrity of the collagen matrix that gives the vein wall its mechanical properties. A vein with a compromised collagen matrix is a vein that dilates more easily under pressure, seals less effectively, and develops the tortuous, distended appearance of a varicose vein more readily, not because of gravity alone, but because the material it is made of has been structurally weakened by a metabolite that a B vitamin could have prevented from accumulating. The elevated CRP represents the systemic inflammatory environment in which all of Thomas's venous tissue was existing. White blood cells adhering to inflamed endothelium release proteases, enzymes that degrade the extracellular matrix. In arterial walls, this process contributes to plaque instability. In venous walls, it degrades the connective tissue that maintains wall integrity and valve function. The inflammation that was registered as a number on a blood test was being enacted daily in the walls of the veins that were producing his evening heaviness. When I say that addressing the inflammation is the deep intervention for venous insufficiency, this is not metaphor. It is a description of the specific molecular damage that inflammation produces in the specific tissue that is failing. Now here is where it gets more complicated and more interesting, because the evening leg heaviness is rarely just a venous story. In a significant proportion of people who experience it, there are two other systems contributing simultaneously. Systems that the vein consultation does not assess and that the standard blood draw does not prioritize for this presentation. The first is the lymphatic system. This is the most overlooked circulatory system in the body, partly because it is harder to image, partly because its failure is less acutely dangerous than arterial or venous failure, and partly because medicine has historically not had strong pharmaceutical interventions for lymphatic compromise, which tends to reduce research investment and clinical attention. The lymphatic system is a one-way drainage network that runs parallel to the venous system throughout the body. Its job is to collect the fluid that leaks out of blood capillaries into the tissue spaces, protein-rich fluid called lymph, and return it to the bloodstream. Without adequate lymphatic drainage, this fluid accumulates in the tissue. In the lower legs, where the lymphatic vessels are working against gravity with the additional mechanical disadvantage of being the furthest point from the heart, the accumulation of lymph produces a specific kind of heaviness, not the sharp, well-defined swelling of acute venous obstruction, but a diffuse, doughy fullness that is often described as the legs feeling like they have been filled with something. The lymphatic vessels, like the veins, have one-way valves. Like the veins, those valves depend on a functionally healthy vessel wall. Like the veins, the lymphatic vessel wall is vulnerable to inflammation, though the specific molecular targets are different. Inflammation in lymphatic vessel walls reduces the intrinsic contractile rhythm of the lymphangions, the individual segments of lymphatic vessel that contract sequentially to pump lymph upward. When the lymphangian contraction frequency falls below its normal range of approximately 6 to 10 contractions per minute, lymph transport slows, fluid accumulates in the tissue, and the legs feel full in the way that is distinct from but often concurrent with venous insufficiency. Venous insufficiency and lymphatic insufficiency frequently coexist because they share several upstream causes: chronic inflammation, prolonged periods of dependency, reduced physical activity, and because venous hypertension, the elevated pressure in the superficial veins that accompanies valvular failure, directly impairs lymphatic drainage by increasing the pressure differential the lymphatic vessels are working against. The evening timing of the heaviness is not coincidental. It is mechanistic. Throughout the day, in upright posture, both venous return and lymphatic drainage are working against gravity. The cumulative effect of hours in an upright position, even a seated upright position, which is actually worse than standing for venous return because seated posture compresses the vessels behind the knee, is a progressive accumulation of fluid in the lower leg tissue. By evening, after 6 to 10 hours of this accumulation, the legs feel what they are, full of fluid that has not been adequately returned to circulation. The calf muscles are the primary pump for both venous return and lymphatic drainage in the lower legs. The rhythmic contraction of the gastrocnemius and soleus muscles during walking compresses both the deep veins and the lymphatic vessels, actively pushing fluid upward against gravity. In a person who has spent 10 hours of the day either seated at a desk or standing with minimal calf muscle activation, standing still is actually less effective than walking because it lacks the rhythmic compression. The pump has barely run all day. The fluid has had nowhere to go. The second overlooked contributor to evening leg heaviness is the one that generates the most surprising conversation when I describe it, because its connection to leg symptoms is not intuitive. The autonomic nervous system, specifically the balance between sympathetic and parasympathetic tone in the peripheral vasculature. The sympathetic nervous system controls vascular tone throughout the body. In the veins, sympathetic signals drive the smooth muscle in the venous wall to contract, reducing venous capacity and improving venous return. This is part of the normal response to standing. The sympathetic system detects the orthostatic stress of upright posture and increases venous tone to maintain blood pressure. In younger people with well-functioning autonomic regulation, this response is rapid and effective. In older adults, and particularly in people with long-standing elevated cortisol from chronic stress, the autonomic regulation of venous tone becomes dysregulated. The sympathetic response to orthostatic stress is blunted. The veins in the lower legs do not receive the toning signal they need to prevent pooling. And the chronic elevated cortisol that drove this dysregulation has simultaneously been degrading the collagen in those venous walls for years. This is the connection between chronic psychological stress and evening leg symptoms that nobody mentions in a vascular surgery consultation. It is not that stress causes varicose veins in a direct sense. It is that chronic cortisol elevation degrades the vascular collagen matrix, impairs autonomic venous tone regulation, promotes systemic inflammation, and drives the insulin resistance that further damages venous smooth muscle function, all simultaneously, all quietly over years, in a person who might otherwise appear to be in reasonable health. So what do? Concretely, specifically, today and tomorrow and in the weeks that follow? The single most impactful intervention for evening leg heaviness, the one with the most robust evidence, the clearest mechanism, and the lowest barrier to implementation, is not a supplement, not a procedure, not a dietary overhaul. It is walking, and specifically the timing and pattern of walking relative to periods of sitting. Research has consistently demonstrated that the relationship between prolonged sitting and venous and lymphatic stasis is not a smooth, linear accumulation. There are inflection points, roughly every 45 to 60 minutes of continuous sitting, at which the progressive venous pooling and lymphatic stasis begin to escalate. A 2-minute walk at the 45-minute mark of sitting not only briefly activates the calf muscle pump and clears accumulated fluid, it resets the accumulation curve back to near zero for the next 45 minutes. 2 minutes. Every 45 minutes. This is not a significant demand on anyone's schedule, and the cumulative effect on end-of-day leg heaviness for people who implement it consistently is substantial. The evening calf raise is the second specific mechanical intervention. Performed after dinner, when the day's accumulation is at its peak, 20 calf raises, pausing for 2 seconds at the top of each one, done 3 times with a minute between sets, generates the same mechanical compression and release of the deep venous and lymphatic vessels that walking does in a targeted, efficient form. The pause at the top is important. The maximum contraction at peak plantar flexion produces the highest intramuscular pressure and therefore the most effective vessel compression. Rushing through calf raises eliminates most of the hydraulic benefit. The legs up the wall position, lying on your back with the legs extended vertically against a wall, held for 10 to 15 minutes, produces passive gravitational drainage of the accumulated fluid that active exercises cannot match. It reverses the pressure gradient that has been working against venous and lymphatic return all day. The fluid that has pooled in the lower leg tissue begins to move toward the body under gravity alone. Most people who do this consistently report that it is the most immediately effective intervention for the evening heaviness, because it is addressing the most immediate cause of the symptom, which is accumulated fluid that needs a pressure gradient reversal to move. But these mechanical interventions address the symptom. The deeper intervention addresses the cause. Reducing systemic inflammation in the venous wall requires the same dietary approach that reduces arterial inflammation, because the endothelium is the endothelium, whether it is lining a vein or an artery, and the molecular mechanisms of inflammatory damage do not distinguish based on the direction of blood flow. Extra virgin olive oil and its oleocanthal content inhibiting COX-1 and COX-2 inflammatory enzymes. Dark berries and their anthocyanins upregulating eNOS and reducing endothelial oxidative stress. Omega-3 fatty acids from fatty fish shifting the inflammatory mediator profile in vessel wall tissue from pro-inflammatory to pro-resolution. But for venous health specifically, there are 2 additional dietary compounds that have the strongest and most specific evidence: diosmin and hesperidin, and rutin. Diosmin and hesperidin are flavonoids found in citrus peel, specifically in the white pith of oranges, lemons, and grapefruits that most people discard. They have been used clinically in Europe as the basis of a pharmaceutical preparation called Daflon for over 40 years for the treatment of chronic venous insufficiency, and the evidence base for their efficacy is substantial. They work through multiple mechanisms specific to venous tissue. They reduce the inflammatory adhesion of white blood cells to venous endothelium. They increase the tone of venous smooth muscle through a mechanism that mimics sympathetic stimulation. They reduce the permeability of capillaries and lymphatic vessels, reducing fluid leakage into tissue, and they protect venous endothelial cells from oxidative damage. The dietary source of these compounds is the citrus pith, not the juice. The juice contains almost none of the active flavonoids. The pith, the thick, bitter white layer between the peel and the fruit segments. Eating half an orange, including the pith, or adding a piece of lemon pith to a cup of warm water and consuming it, these are not pleasant-tasting interventions, which is perhaps why they have not become dietary staples. But the evidence for their vascular effects is specific and clinically validated in a way that few dietary compounds can match. Rutin is another flavonoid found in buckwheat, capers, and asparagus that has direct venous-specific activity. It inhibits the enzyme PDI, protein disulfide isomerase, which is released by activated platelets and endothelial cells during venous inflammation and which promotes clot formation in sluggish venous flow. The relationship between chronic venous insufficiency and deep vein thrombosis risk is well established. People with venous stasis are at elevated DVT risk partly because of PDI-mediated clotting in the areas of stagnant flow. Rutin's PDI inhibition is a specific mechanism relevant to this risk, and the dietary sources, buckwheat, particularly in its whole grain form, and capers, are readily available and easily incorporated. Homocysteine management through adequate B vitamin intake is perhaps the most straightforwardly correctable contributor to venous wall damage in the population. Folate, B6, and B12 are the three nutrients required for the enzymatic conversion of homocysteine to methionine. In deficiency of any of the three, homocysteine accumulates. Dietary sources of folate include dark leafy greens, particularly asparagus, spinach, and edamame. B12 is found in animal foods, and its absorption decreases significantly with age due to declining intrinsic factor production in the stomach, meaning that many older adults who have adequate dietary B12 are absorbing a fraction of it. A sublingual B12 supplement which bypasses the digestive absorption pathway and enters the bloodstream directly through the oral mucosa is one of the more evidence-supported supplement interventions for this specific population. The lymphatic system responds to an intervention that is almost too simple to take seriously until you understand the mechanism: deep, diaphragmatic breathing. The thoracic lymphatic duct, the main trunk of the lymphatic system that drains approximately 3/4 of the body's lymph back into the bloodstream, relies on changes in intrathoracic pressure for its function. Each deep inhalation creates a pressure drop in the chest cavity that acts as a suction pump on the thoracic duct. Shallow chest breathing, which is the pattern adopted by most adults under chronic stress, generates insufficient pressure change to drive optimal lymphatic flow. Deep diaphragmatic breathing, the kind that inflates the abdomen rather than the chest, produces the thoracic pressure changes that drive lymph transport from the lower body toward the central circulation. 5 minutes of deep diaphragmatic breathing in the legs up the wall position in the evening combines the gravitational drainage effect with the suction pump effect on the thoracic duct and the vagal activation that reduces sympathetic overactivation in the venous system. It is mechanistically addressing 3 of the contributing factors simultaneously. It is also, practically speaking, the least dramatic thing anyone has ever been prescribed for a vascular symptom. Thomas, 3 months after addressing the inflammatory markers, the homocysteine, the dietary changes, and implementing the mechanical interventions, the 45-minute walk interruptions at work, the evening calf raises, the legs up the wall breathing, reported that his evening leg heaviness had reduced by what he estimated as 70%. He still had his varicose veins. They were visible. He had not had the procedure. But the heaviness that had been making his evenings miserable for 3 years was no longer defining them. He also said something that surprised him when he said it out loud. His legs had started telling him things. He noticed that the heaviness returned on days when he sat continuously for more than 3 hours. He noticed it was worse in the weeks when he was most stressed. He noticed it was better in the weeks when he ate fish twice and used olive oil generously. He had started reading his legs the way you read a gauge, not as a symptom to be suppressed, but as real-time information about what his body was experiencing. This is perhaps the most useful reframe available to someone living with evening leg heaviness. Not that the heaviness is a problem to be eliminated, but that it is a signal to be interpreted. It is the legs reporting, with considerable accuracy and consistency, the cumulative metabolic, inflammatory, and mechanical state of the venous and lymphatic systems that serve them. Prolonged sitting, the pump did not run today. Chronic inflammation, the vessel walls are taking inflammatory damage. Elevated homocysteine, the endothelial collagen is being degraded. Chronic cortisol elevation, the autonomic venous tone is dysregulated. Each of these has a correctable cause. None of them was identified in a 4-minute conversation about compression stockings. The legs are heavy in the evening because they have been trying to tell you something all day. They are still trying. The question is whether the conversation has finally been had in enough depth to know what they are saying. Now you do.